Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by OraSure Technologies. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral fluid-based testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost savings with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, and clinical screening programs, among others. Today's presentation is entitled How to Improve Your Drug Testing Program and Lab-Based Oral Fluid Testing, and will be presented by Bill Current and Roxanne Merrick. Bill Current is the president of WFC & Associates, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and providing accurate and up-to-date state drug testing law information. He is the editor of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He also publishes the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly. Mr. Current is the former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education and served as vice president of consulting for a national third-party administrator of drug testing and background screening services. He founded WFC & Associates in 1998. He is the author or co-author of 10 books on substance abuse issues, including Why Drug Testing. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 16th year. Roxanne Merrick is the director at the Matagorda Wharton County Adult Probation Department. She began her career in criminal justice as an adult probation officer in Jackson County and later moved to Wharton County, where she became the unit supervisor in 2008. She was appointed director of Wharton Matagorda County CSCD in 2009. She is a member of the Texas Corrections Association, the American Probation and Parole Association, and the Texas Probation Association, where she served on the board of directors from 1997 to 2009. She was awarded the TPA President's Award in 2001 and 2005, and TPA Charles W. Hawks Lifetime Achievement Award in 2009, and the TCA Line Officer of the Year in 1998 and 2008. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current and Roxanne Merrick.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and we'd like to welcome everybody who is on today's webinar. First, I'd like to thank OraSure Technologies for hosting this monthly webinar series and bringing this type of information to people who are in the drug testing industry, in the drug testing business, as well as those who use the services of drug testing providers. So thanks again to OraSure Technologies. I'm really excited today to be co-presenting with Roxanne Merrick. She and I have had an opportunity to get to know each other over the last several weeks in preparation for today's webinar. And I think when we get to her part of the presentation, you're going to really find it very, very interesting. So we'll build up to that. Now, as the description for today's webinar pointed out, substance abuse in the United States is heading in the wrong direction. The trends are all heading up. And marijuana and the abuse of prescription drugs are really fueling this overall increase in drug abuse throughout the United States. Criminal justice professionals, which many of the attendees of today's webinars know, you're dealing with this issue every day. So a lot of the problems that are only known to other people in our country through the headlines that they read in the paper and online are the things that criminal justice professionals deal with every day. Drug testing of prisoners, parolees, and others who find themselves in the criminal justice system is a very effective way to help people get their lives in order if they're willing to do that. It creates a level of accountability in the criminal justice system for those who have problems with drugs. But traditional drug testing methods, which almost always involve urine testing, are susceptible to problems. It's not that they're not good. It's not that urine testing is not a good, solid way to do drug testing. It is. But it's subject to certain issues that drug abusers can take advantage of. And one of the biggest ones is just cheating, substituting a clean urine sample for a dirty urine sample, or adding something to a urine sample to make it appear as if it's okay. And so it's subject to drug test cheating, and that complicates matters. Lab-based oral fluid testing is one of the alternatives that's available to urine testing that bypasses some of these issues that have been commonly associated with and are inherent in a traditional urine testing program, such as drug test cheating. And we're going to talk about what those features are a little bit later in today's presentation. We're going to start out, though, with a little review of the latest substance abuse statistics from the federal government. We're going to talk about how substance abuse impacts crime, and then we'll get into lab-based oral fluid testing, how it helps to protect the dignity of the testing process and the donor in particular. We'll sort of debunk some of the common myths associated with lab-based oral fluid testing, and then talk specifically about how oral fluid testing can be used in a variety of criminal justice situations. And that's when we'll get to Roxanne's part of the presentation. She has extensive experience, not just in criminal justice, of course, 25 years in the business, but also in using oral fluid testing as part of her program. So let's start out with some basic statistics, just to make sure we're all on the same page. First and foremost, there's a study that comes out from the federal government every year. It's called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It used to be called the National Household Survey, but the name changed several years ago. But it's the same study, same format, and it's been coming out since the 1970s. The 2012 statistics, which were released in 2013, so this is the latest data available from the federal government, shows that there are approximately 24 million Americans 12 and older who admit to being current past month illicit drug users. And a current user, under the definition that the federal government uses, is someone who has used an illicit drug at least one time in the 30 days prior to being surveyed, so about 24 million. That's about 9.2% of the population in that age, in that age category. And the overall rate of current illicit drug use among persons 12 and older in 2012, that third bullet there, similar to the last 3 years prior to that, but a full percentage point higher than 2002 to 2008. 1% higher when you talk about the tens of millions of people who are involved in this is a significant increase. So from 2008 to 2009, we saw a significant jump. And that statistic is not coming down. It is very steady at that 9.9% to 9.2% range. That's significant. And the interest in and the use of marijuana is the basic thing behind the increase in drug abuse. Nearly 19 million current users of marijuana. And about 2/3 of illicit drug users say the only drug they use is marijuana. So it's the drug of choice for a lot of drug users, and in some cases it's the only drug that they use. Now, current users of illicit drugs other than marijuana is still a significant category. 8.9 million persons 12 and older fit in that category. If you go down to the last bullet on this slide, the majority of these quote-unquote non-marijuana users are people who are abusing psychotherapeutic drugs. We're talking about typical prescription medications, pain relievers, tranquilizers, stimulants, and sedatives. And the numbers, as you can see in some cases, 4.9 million users of pain relievers, I'm talking about non-medical use of pain relievers, is significant. And so that is also an increasing number, and it's also helping to fuel the overall increase in drug abuse. And I want you to take a look at this chart, because this really sort of puts the issue in a frame that we can all see and understand. For many years, as part of the National Household Survey, under the old name, cocaine was always the number 2 drug of abuse under marijuana. It was always marijuana number 1, cocaine number 2 for many, many years. And over the last several years, we've seen the misuse of psychotherapeutic medications, these prescription drugs, creeping up the ladder until now it has a significant hold on the number 2 spot in the government survey. 18.9 million marijuana, 6.8 million misusers or abusers of psychotherapeutic drugs. That's significant, because when we talk about having a drug-free society, a drug-free workplace, a drug-free school, it really comes down to whether or not we're testing for the drugs that people are using. So if we're just testing for marijuana, which is important, we're not going to necessarily catch all the people who are coming into our workplace or into our society into our community that are actually abusing drugs and posing a danger to society. And it's a problem that starts at a very early age. This is the breakdown of drug abuse by age categories. And so as you look at the chart, the bar graph there at the bottom, you see to the far left the tallest bar is the blue one, and that's the abuse of psychotherapeutic medications. So among 12 and 13-year-olds, that's the drug of choice, is various, sedatives, tranquilizers, etc. Marijuana is the gray bar next to it, and among 12 and 13-year-olds, even though that's an unacceptable number, of course, it doesn't compare to the abuse of psychotherapeutic drugs. In the 14 to 15 age category, you see marijuana shoots up. It becomes the drug of choice. Psychotherapeutic drug abuse increases in this age category, but doesn't keep pace with now the sort of interest in marijuana among 14 and 15-year-olds. And then by the time you get to 16 and 17, which are, say, juniors and seniors in high school, marijuana continues to increase by a significant rate. Psychotherapeutic drug abuse also increases significantly, but again, not keeping pace with marijuana. That's a very significant thing if you're in the business of conducting drug tests, whether it's in criminal justice, the workplace, or wherever. You want to know what's coming up the pike. And at the very earliest stage, the abuse of psychotherapeutic drugs is number one, but then again, by about the sophomore, junior, senior year of high school, the number one drug of abuse by far is marijuana. Now, I'm going to share some workplace statistics, even though the vast majority of our audience today are from the criminal justice profession, because there's definitely a connection here. So, in the same survey, the rate of current illicit drug use among unemployed individuals is higher than those who are employed full or part-time. That's important to know. But the percentage of drug users overall, 69, almost 68% of drug abusing adults, 18 and older, were employed either full or part-time. So when you start to think about some of the stereotypes of a typical drug abuser, and you start to think about somebody who, can't hold down a job, etc., it's not necessarily always the case. A very healthy percentage, 68%, of the 14.6 million adult drug abusers, and we're talking about current drug abusers, have a job. Now, there's another study out from the federal government that shows that they tend to change jobs often, and they'll have a very significant percentage will have between 2 and 3 jobs with different employers during a year. But they're always finding work, and so that's important to know as well. I've got some other workplace statistics coming up. Let's switch gears, though, at this point and talk a little bit about substance abuse and crime. And these are things, of course, that criminal justice professionals are very, very well aware of and acquainted with these type of statistics. In a report from 2004 that was released in 2006, so it's about 8 years old at this point, 17% of state prisoners and 18% of federal prisoners admitted themselves that they committed whatever their current offense was to obtain money for drugs. So they were committing crimes to get money to buy drugs. And then about 26%, in that next paragraph down, 26% of victims of violence reported that they perceived that the offender was using drugs or alcohol at the time of the crime. And that's a fairly significant number, as you see there, 5.2 million victims of violent crimes. Between 1995 and 2000, this is specific to college campuses, 41% of violent crimes committed against college students and 38% of non-students were committed by an offender perceived to be using drugs, and 40%, 2 in 5 of all rape and sexual assaults, and about a quarter of all robberies against college students were committed by an offender, again, who was perceived to have been using drugs. So, very pervasive issue. Let's go back to the workplace just for a second. Of workplace victims of violence, Okay, this is not workplace accidents necessarily. There's a lot of statistics on workplace accidents. But of violent acts in the workplace, the victims, 35% believe that the offender was drinking or using drugs at the time of the incident. 40%, and it depended on the occupation. So 40% of individuals in law enforcement perceived that the offender was using alcohol and drugs, 35% in the medical field, and 31% in retail. You kind of maybe can understand the 47% in law enforcement and even the 35% in the medical field, where the access to drugs is quite liberal there. But 31% in the retail industry, that's a significant percentage right there in what is normally considered among various industries, right? When we talk about drug abuse in the workplace, we're typically talking about workplace safety-sensitive type of occupations where you see the rate of drug abuse higher. But here, 31% in the retail industry and retail sales, that's fairly significant. That's something to take note of. Now, let's connect the sort of traditional talk about drug abuse with alcohol abuse for a moment. There's 3 different categories of alcohol abusers in that National Survey on Drug Use and Health. There's current drinkers, there's binge alcohol users, and there's heavy drinkers. A current drinker is somebody who admits to having a drink sometime in the last year. And as you can see, a lot of people drink. This translates to the 52.1% in that category translates to about 135.5 million current drinkers. What we're concerned about, though, are binge drinkers. Binge drinkers are people who admit to having at least 5 drugs on at least one occasion in the 30 days prior to being surveyed, and that comes out to 59.7 million people. And then heavy drinkers are people who admit, of course this is self-admitting, heavy drinkers are people who admit to having at least 5 drinks on at least 5 occasions in the last 30 days, and that's about 17 million. So even though the number comes down significantly from 135 million to 17 million, people who drink a lot is still a significant number of individuals in our country. And that, of course, factors into crime, and it factors into other areas as well. Now, I'm going to show you this list of occupations by heavy alcohol use. Again, individuals who admit to having at least 5 drinks on at least 5 occasions in the last 30 days. You can see a lot of these occupations are part of the construction industry: roofers, electricians, carpenters, construction laborers, etc. The highest being roofers at 25.7%, but still a significant percentage of electricians and carpenters, etc., admit to being heavy alcohol users. And then you get down to food services, retail sales, different types of sales occupations, cooks. Why would this be of interest to people in the criminal justice field? Well, of course, because part of the way you're trying to help people is to push them towards getting employment, and these are the type of jobs where they're typically going to find employment. Not always the case, and I apologize. I don't mean to sound like I'm stereotyping people in the criminal justice system into these types of occupations, because it's not always the case. But just like some of you, I have a relative who has had trouble with the law because of substance abuse, and in the times when he's not in jail and not incarcerated, these are the type of occupations that he's typically found work in. And so they're finding work in these areas when they can, and when they do, they're around a lot of people who are heavy alcohol users. And I don't have the same chart for drug abuse, but I can tell you it's very similar. I've seen it. It's very similar to the list of occupations with heavy alcohol use. And this is where a lot of people who in the criminal justice system, these are the kind of people that they're working side by side with, because these are the kind of jobs that they can typically find. And again, I apologize. I'm not trying to be stereotyping anyone. Now, a few more statistics about alcohol abuse and crime. 36% of those under correctional supervision at the time were drinking at the time of their conviction offense. And if you go down to that last bullet on the page, the federal research shows that for the 40% of convicted murderers being held in either jail or state prison, alcohol use was a factor in the homicide. Again, I'm sure these are statistics that our criminal justice attendees today are well aware of. And again, I shouldn't say again, but for your information, anybody on today's call who would like to have these slides, just email us at the end of the presentation. We'll be happy to share this slide deck with you. Alcohol is a factor in 40% of all violent crimes today. go down to the last, those 4 bullets there, 37% of rapes and sexual assaults, 15% of robberies, 27% of aggravated assaults, and even 25% of simple assaults. So that, again, is an issue connecting alcohol abuse and crime. And I wish I had, but I didn't use this statistic from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that shows the overlap between people who admit to being current drug users and people who admit to being heavy alcohol users. But there's a significant percentage of people who are both current drug users and heavy alcohol users. So a lot of the statistics I'm showing here for alcohol and crime would certainly involve people who are involved in drug abuse as well. Again, some of the same statistics that we've looked at in the past few slides. We'll just go past some of those so that I'm not eating up too much of the time so we can get to Roxanne's part. But again, you'll have access to all of these slides. We know, of course, that there's a significant connection between driving under the influence and accidents and fatalities, traffic-related fatalities. One statistic I don't have on here that you might find of interest, over the last 10 years, the rate of THC-related traffic fatalities, THC, of course, being the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, the rate of THC-related traffic fatalities in the last 10 years has tripled. And it just happens to coincide with the sort of success rate of the pro-marijuana people getting marijuana legalized in a number of states across the country. There are 21 states, actually 22 states now, because Minnesota just legalized marijuana for medical purposes about a week or two ago. So about 22 states plus the District of Columbia that have now legalized marijuana for medical use, and 2 states, Colorado and Washington, where marijuana has been legalized generally. They call it for recreational use, but it's legal, period, in Colorado and Washington, and a number of states considering similar legislation in 2014. I don't have that statistic here under the DWI-related issues, but it's something that factors in. The increase in access to marijuana and being able to use marijuana, quote-unquote, legally is also leading to more traffic fatalities. This is an interesting study from the Pew Institute. 5.3 million adults, that's 36% of those under correctional supervision at the time, were drinking at the time of their conviction. I think we kind of saw the basis of all of these stats a little bit earlier. And I'm going to, again, make all of these available to you so that you have them. But I wanted to go down to that last section. Providing treatment without holding offenders accountable for their performance in treatment has proven to be very much less effective than when they are held accountable. And this particular study that I'm quoting here from the National Association of Drug Court Professionals has to do with drug courts, of course, and being supervised regularly by a judge through a drug court. 60 to 80% drop out of treatment prematurely, and few successfully graduate when they lack that supervision. And I might add that the same could hold true for drug testing. Drug testing has proven to be a very powerful weapon in the war against drug abuse, and it is a way to help identify people that need help. It's also a way to deter drug use among those people who are struggling with drug problems. And today there are lots of different options available for conducting drug testing. And one of the drug testing methods that is growing in popularity right now is lab-based oral fluid testing. It's growing in popularity among people who are in the drug testing field, those who provide drug testing services, because they're dealing with clients that find traditional urine testing programs to not exactly fit their needs. And also because in the workplace industry, the federal government is in the process of developing regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing that will make it possible for employers who find themselves under federal mandate, like under the Department of Transportation regulations, to use lab-based oral fluid testing as an alternative to lab-based urine testing. And so lab-based oral fluid testing is growing in popularity among drug testing providers and in some industries among drug testing buyers as well. But there are a lot of myths about oral fluid testing that are sort of lingering on, despite the fact that there's a lot of good information out there now about lab-based oral fluid testing. And I keep saying lab-based oral fluid testing. I want to make the distinction here that there's a significant difference in the technology and the science behind instant result oral fluid testing and lab-based oral fluid testing. And I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides. But I keep saying lab-based oral fluid testing to sort of be clear that I'm not talking about instant result oral fluid testing, you know, those single-use disposable devices. I'm talking about collecting a sample, sending it to a laboratory where it can be analyzed using the equipment in a certified laboratory. So we'll talk for a few minutes about the accuracy issue, the whole issue involving the window of detection, marijuana, which is a big issue, and then, of course, drug test cheating, which is one of the big advantages of oral fluid testing. Now, the presence of drugs in oral fluid, as it says in that first statement there, is usually related to the amount of drug in the bloodstream at the time of the sample collection. Oral fluid mimics blood when it comes to drug testing in many respects. Many of the smartest people in the drug testing industry, the scientists, will tell you that blood is really the gold standard of drug testing, but it's impractical in most situations and very costly. Oral fluid testing is similar to blood in the sense that you can, with oral fluid testing, you can detect both the parent drug and not just the metabolite of the drug, okay? And drug use becomes detectable almost immediately after an individual has used drugs. So within minutes after somebody smokes a joint, for example, you would be able to get a positive drug test off an oral fluid sample, whereas with urine, there's typically going to be a delay before that drug use will appear in a urine sample when it's being tested. Okay, so this is very important because it really addresses the issue of accuracy. And I've got a couple of slides coming up on that. A few things to look for, though, in terms of making sure that you're getting an accurate drug testing system. You want to go with a product or a service where they've got empirical, independent data that's been published in peer-reviewed journals. In other words, don't depend entirely on the marketing materials of the provider of the oral fluid testing that you're considering using, but ask for independent data, studies that have been done on it, so that it's not just coming from the marketing folks, which are great people, but it's coming from the scientists and the researchers who, devote themselves to this type of research. You want to make sure you're dealing with an FDA-cleared collection device as well as assay in the laboratory. In other words, you want to deal with you want the device to be FDA cleared, that you're collecting and the oral fluid test, you're putting it into the device and you're sending it to a laboratory. But you also want to make sure that the drugs that you're testing for at the laboratory, that testing system in the lab has also been FDA cleared. And that gives you the assurance of both the collection device and the actual analysis in the laboratory being FDA cleared. And that's an important issue. You want to deal with a company that's been in the business for a while. You want them to have, be able to provide referrals of people who are in your specific occupation, so you're comparing apples to apples. But then I would really encourage you to do your own internal research. I mean, get some samples of the product and test it out for yourself. Put the package insert to the test. Go through the package insert, which is going to describe how to use the product, what the product should be able to produce in terms of results, and then put it to the test. And most manufacturers, the really legitimate ones, are going to be able to provide some samples to you so that you can do that, so that you know who you're doing business with. And I think that's really critical if you're going to, place somebody's freedom in the case of the criminal justice system, or employment in the case of the workplace. If you're going to put that on the line, you want to make sure you're dealing with a reputable company with an FDA-cleared device and testing system. Now, one of the issues that comes up with oral fluid testing is the window of detection. The window of detection is a little bit shorter with oral fluid testing, but the window of detection always depends on a number of factors that are consistent between between urine testing and oral fluid testing, hair testing, and blood testing, which is the amount of drugs that the individuals use, the actual drugs that they've used. Each specimen has its own unique window of detection. Okay, and so you need to take all of those things into account. But because the window of detection opens up sooner with oral fluid testing, you're going to be able to get more positives of people who are just recently used the drug versus urine, which has that lag time of an hour or so. The window of detection is going to stay open a little longer with urine, so you're going to catch some people on the outside of that window of detection with urine that you might not necessarily catch with oral fluid testing. So you want to be able to look at all of it and put it in the context of your particular situation and pick the testing method that's best for you. But you can see from this chart, the blue line is oral fluid testing and the yellow line is urine. And so there is going to be a lag time of some hours before you can detect the drug in a urine sample, whereas with oral fluid, that window of detection opens up almost immediately after the individual has ingested the drugs. Depending on the circumstances, that immediate opening of the window of detection may be what you're looking for, in which case you have a choice between blood and oral fluid. And of course, oral fluid is much more accessible, less intrusive, and more oral fluid testing more cost effective as well. The positivity rates, very, very similar. Again, you're going to catch some on the front end of the window with oral fluid that you would miss with urine testing. But when you compare them side by side, and this sort of debunks one of the big myths, is that you're going to miss a lot of positives with oral fluid testing versus urine. That has not proven to be the case. The overall positivity rate from a study of over 4.5 million Intercept devices, that's the oral fluid test device from OraSure, shows a 4.1% positivity rate versus 4.4%, but scan down to that fourth line there, THC. Look how the positivity rate for marijuana is actually a little bit higher with lab-based oral fluid testing than with urine testing, something that most people would probably not think would be the case. And yet, from millions and millions of samples being compared side by side, you can detect marijuana in an oral fluid sample. The answer is yes. There are a lot of factors that come into play, but lab-based oral fluid testing is an effective way to detect marijuana. And it's detectable within an hour after somebody has ingested the drugs. Now, cutoff levels come into play. As I said, the testing method, lab-based versus point-of-collection testing, the POCT, that's the instant disposable devices. That's a big factor right there because the window of detection, the cutoff levels with a POCT instant device are going to be much higher than with lab-based testing. Lab-based is going to mimic urine testing in terms of cutoff levels, maybe even slightly more sensitive. Whereas with the instant testing devices, you're not going to have that level of sensitivity, so that in order to get an accurate result, they have to raise that cutoff level, and then it's no longer apples to apples when you compare instant oral fluid testing to lab-based oral fluid testing. It may still be that instant oral fluid testing is a good fit for your organization, but you need to know what you're getting. You're not going to get the type of positivity rates for marijuana that you do get with lab-based oral fluid testing. And that just is, sort of the fact of the matter when it comes to comparing one technology with another. And this is a good chart that just really illustrates it. You can see that dotted vertical line there. That's right there at 50 nanograms per milliliter. That's the cutoff level. The majority of THC positives are going to be below 50 nanograms. So you have to have a testing system that can detect THC below 50 nanograms. The majority of POCT oral fluid devices are going to be 40 nanograms per milliliter or much higher than that. So and you can see that the majority of those blue bars, those vertical blue bars on the far left of the chart, are actually far less than 50 nanograms. They're in the 20 nanogram or lower range, and that's only possible with lab-based oral fluid testing. You're not going to get that type of sensitivity from an instant oral fluid testing device. And again, it may be right for you, but you just need to know what you're going to get and what you're not going to get. And you're not going to get a lot of positives when it comes to detecting THC with an instant oral fluid testing system. Now, one of the big advantages of oral fluid testing, and Roxanne's going to talk to this in more detail, so I'll just sort of skim through this, is the fact that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible in most situations, to cheat on an oral fluid test versus a urine test. If you go onto the internet and you do a search on beat the drug test, you're literally going to find hundreds of thousands of hits. You're going to get hundreds of thousands of hits for beating a urine drug test. And you're going to find very little advice on how to successfully cheat on an oral fluid test. It's just very, very difficult because the donor and the collector are standing right in front of each other. It's just impossible for somebody to slip something in or substitute a dirty sample with a clean sample. I did visit one website where they said try to avoid the test if you're going to be tested with oral fluid. Avoid submitting saliva. And then the last part that I have underlined there, between these periods of time, You must avoid being screened or you will surely test positive. So some of the best advice you'll find on the internet for how to beat an oral fluid test is just find some way to get out of the test. Don't give them your saliva, because if you do, you're most likely going to test positive. So a lot of advantages to oral fluid testing. It's flexible. It can be conducted anytime, anywhere. The science is accurate, legally defensible, and legal in virtually all states, especially for criminal justice. I don't know of any states that prohibit it legally. And some of the ones on this slide I'm going to skip, because in talking to Roxanne, she actually has personal experience in the criminal justice field dealing with the collection issues, matching up the gender of the collector with the client, etc. So I'll leave that to her. But most importantly, when it comes to oral fluid testing, you just want to make sure that you've correctly identified what your drug testing needs are. What are the things that cause the most pain when you try to administer your drug testing program? And then find the testing method that lines up with those issues, with those needs that you have. And you'll find in many cases some of the problems that are inherent with urine testing, which is a great testing method, and it's still the most widely used testing method, especially in the workplace market. But some of the inherent problems with urine testing are actually resolved when it comes to lab-based oral fluid testing in particular. So with that, I'd like to bring on my co-presenter, Roxanne Merrick. She's with the Matagorda Wharton County Adult Probation Department. And Roxanne, maybe we can start by just sort of letting you share some of your experiences, and then we'll get into some specific issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bill. I really enjoyed the presentation so far. As Bill said, I have got quite a few years in the profession, all of it being spent in probation in one capacity or another. Of course, I did begin this career when I was about 4, so I'm really not all that old, but I've got quite a few years of service. The majority of my years did come in as a specialized caseload officer. So actually the oral drug testing, oral fluids testing was something that came in while I was actually supervising cases, and it was cutting edge technology at the time. And please understand, I'm in a part of rural Texas. I'm about 65 miles southwest of Houston, in a county of about 41,000 people. In the entire county, not in the county seat, but in the entire county. So there's generally at any given time about 10 staff members in one of our units, or in each one of our units. There's 2 units. And what we have found with the oral fluids testing was there was quite a bit of a surprise factor, because a lot of our clients at that particular time weren't necessarily internet savvy. Of course, that was something that a lot of people didn't have in 2006 or so. And they didn't realize that they could be tested with oral fluids. And a lot of our folks actually, even though they are internet savvy and they have smartphones now, they don't think about that, because they're just talking about the pee test, the urine test, all these things that you can do to beat that. So what we found was very interesting was the times when I had clients coming in on my caseload, and I knew that they were buying urine on the street. They were all ready to give me a UA because they knew they were going to be tested. How they knew, they just kind of gathered that. It wasn't like they were told. But, you know, when you come in and you have an oral fluids test in your hand and you don't have the traditional UA cup, it's kind of that let me drop my jaw and pick it up off the floor kind of reaction. Oh, what is that? And, oh, you can do that? Really? And it wasn't like, is this allowed by my court order? It was like, you can really test spit and find out that there's something in there? And it was kind of a funny question the first couple of times I heard that, but the reality was it was pretty shocking. This guy had just spent $50 on a urine specimen that was supposed to be clean on the street, and he didn't even need it. Didn't even get a chance to submit it. So I'm sure the aggravation factor on that was not very good for him. I'm sure I wasn't his favorite PO at that point. But nonetheless, we found out what was going on with him, because the surprise element was tremendous. Some of the other kind of things that we see in our office here, which, you know, as Bill mentioned, we'll speak to things like gender neutrality, is we've only got a couple of men in our office. We are an office of a lot of women. And everybody in our town pretty much knows what we drive. Everybody knows what color my car is and what color the other officer's truck is. And I can remember having to see a client for one of the male officers, and I knew that this guy needed to be drug tested, and he said, "Well, since my officer's not here, I guess I can't be drug tested, right?" And I said, "Wrong. As a matter of fact, I can test you." Of course, the look on his face was pretty funny because at that point he thought I was going to walk down the hall and go to the restroom with him. Well, that certainly wasn't going to happen. So I said, "No, let me tell you about this new thing that we just started." Showed him the oral fluids test, and sure enough, we got a positive on him. But I think the shock factor on him was also something that was huge, because he had driven by here and decided that, oh, he didn't see his officer's truck, so I don't have to really worry about this whole test thing. Wrong. And I think that now, as an administrator, that is something that we find to be huge with the gender neutrality between the collector and the client, because there are times that with just 2 male staff members in an office of a total of 11 people, we could keep those guys running up and down the hall to the restroom during most of the day. They wouldn't get to do their work, and that is a huge issue for them, not being able to do their work, but it also becomes prohibitive in the female officers wanting to go and ask them, "Hey, can you go down the hall with my client again because he's here again for his UA?" This kind of stops some of that. So it allows us a lot more freedom to conduct the tests. In addition, the gender neutrality is really handy in the field. As Bill had alluded to, the test can be conducted anywhere. You don't have to have anything special other than the collection kit, and that can be done just by, of course, they just put the little test stick in their mouth and leave it there for a few minutes and put it into the solution. So we have actually used these in the field, and generally we have a male and a female officer on our field visits as part of our policy, but as a matter of safety, you certainly wouldn't want to enter into an offender's home and go to the restroom with them. That would just be putting the officer in a huge amount of danger. So there again, that's something that allows us a lot of freedom, gender neutrality, as well as the freedom of where we can actually do the tests. I've mentioned that the time away from the work is something that we've noticed. The guys are not running up and down the hall either to have to observe collections. But all of those things, I think, they all play into the success of this into our program. But the fact that someone cannot cheat on the test is something that I think is extremely important as we really move into an era of evidence-based practices and trying to make sure that we are really holding offenders accountable. We've always held offenders accountable, but now, as we were talking earlier in this, there's the treatment component. And as we are doing treatment, we want to make sure people are accountable for their staying clean. And they know that they can't cheat on these. There's no possible way. Nothing affects these tests like going out and buying something that you can eat or drink, and then within 7 hours your urine's going to be clean. You can't drink bleach or pickle juice or any of a various sundry of things that I've heard people do to try to pass the drug test, and I think that accountability is huge. Also, along the lines of those kinds of things with the evidence-based practices is the dignity of the client, and that's something that, coming from this profession for the past 25 years, hasn't always been at the forefront. We've always thought clients are clients, and yes, we understand that, but we used to have, at one point in my career, kind of a tail 'em, nail 'em, jail 'em philosophy. Let's catch them doing what they're doing and lock them up. That's not so much how it is now. Now we want to try to find out what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what can we do to stop that. And that's how we address the recidivism issue, is to try to stop the behavior and make sure it doesn't happen anymore. And in any drug testing program, you definitely want to have the client buying into it. It's a whole lot easier for a client to buy into a program that they're not going to be embarrassed in. This type of program has them a little bit more dignified. The officer's not going down to the restroom with them. In our office, it's a small office. Like I said, 11 people at any given time, 10 or 11. It's a whole lot better to not have everybody in the office having to witness that UA at some point in time. It's not a very comfortable position for that client to be in. So this way, yes, they still have to do urine testing, but it's just not quite as often, and usually it is just with their officer or, a particular one designated male officer. And there's not as much of that. We do a lot of the oral fluids testing in addition to the UAs. Because the oral fluids are also the lab work is conducted in such a way that we can use it in court, our courts are extremely fond of it. One of the things that we spent a lot of time before my part of this was talking about marijuana, and I know that at some point people have said, well, there's not that large window of detection, so we really don't want to use the oral fluids test for our marijuana users. Well, I would beg to differ with that, because as much as I don't want to believe that people smoke weed driving up to the probation department, I can attest to the fact that they do, because I've had clients who did it, and they knew that it would take a while for it to get into their urine. So there again was a surprise factor. They didn't realize that we had a new kind of test that could detect marijuana almost immediately. So the ones that drove 30 minutes over here smoking weed in the car, shame on them, because we were able to catch them. So those are the kinds of things that we have found in our program to be extremely beneficial. The fact that this offers us one more tool in our toolbox is a phenomenal thing. Our offenders have come back and said, that actually was a good thing. I'm glad that it worked out the way it did. And I'm not sure if we had to spend 5 or 6 hours waiting for them to actually provide a specimen because they were drinking 12 gallons of water waiting. I'm not sure they would have had some of those same thoughts. Not to say, again, that we don't use urine tests, but I think the oral fluids test in many ways has kept that dignity there and still allowed us to do what the courts are needing us to do. So it's definitely been a great addition to what we've been doing, and we've expanded that through our diversion caseloads as well as our bond supervision caseloads.
So, Roxanne, you talked a little bit about the urine collection process, matching the client with the officer, or the gender matching of the client and the officer. Could you walk us through what the typical oral fluid collection process looks like? I mean, where in the office are you at? How long does it take? What's involved in that?
It's usually probably, I would say, maybe 7 or 8 minutes of the office visit, and instead of having the client wait in the front lobby, normally if you're doing a UA, you would have the client wait in the front lobby here. We would have the officer, especially if it's like I'm seeing a male client, because I'm female, I'd get one of the guys to go up front, get that client, take them to the back, have them collect the specimen. We'd go into a whole other room because we're not going to test the urine on my desk because heaven forbid I spill it all over my case file. And that could probably happen very easily. So we go into another room. So I've taken time away from the officer who had to go down the hall with me, and now my time to go prep that area, actually do the UA, and we're 15, 20 minutes later, provided the offender can provide a specimen. Now with the oral testing, as opposed to all of that, I would call the offender back in my office, we would do our office visit, and then we would do the test, usually at the close of the visit. There might be times I might do it at the beginning, and if I thought maybe they would want to talk to me and admit that they had been using, and that's always a possibility. It would depend on the client, but usually at the front end or the back end of the test, or the office visit is when we would do the test. And as opposed to 20 minutes out of my day, it would be 7 or 8.
So what kind of paperwork is involved with the oral fluid testing?
Really, it's not any different from any type of lab testing that you would do for urine. Actually, I think it's even a little bit less because there's less taping up of the specimen. Usually it's a form in triplicate, and it's enclosed in the packet. Put it in with the bag that contains the specimen, and you're good to go.
And what's sort of the turnaround time typically for getting a result back? It
really depends a lot upon the lab that you're using, and and whether or not you're FedExing overnight, but the turnaround time is not bad. It's not weeks long. It's usually just a couple of days. Most of the labs that we've worked with have been very, very good to work with. They'll set us up with a FedEx account, and that way we can send everything in, and we can turn it around within 24 hours of their receipt of it. So it might be like a 48-hour turnaround.
And have you noticed any swing one way or the other in terms of positivity rates? Are you still kind of getting what you were getting before with the urinalysis, or is it different one way or the other?
It's really not. I think there's still that surprise factor with the oral fluids. They never quite expect that, and they can't quote unquote study for it and bring us a specimen that they purchased on the streets. So I really think that we're still right about where we were. We may even be catching a few additional with the oral fluids that we weren't catching with urine.
Okay. And I just want to apologize to our audience just in case the noise is coming through. There's a huge thunderstorm moving through this part of South Florida where I work, and so I can hear it pretty loud. I hope it's not disturbing anybody. And then one more question. So might lead to two questions, but first off, so you have experience using urine testing, of course, and then with oral fluid testing, and I think as I was listening to your presentation, you really sort of get the best of both technologies. It sounds like, is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so, when it comes to the individual that's being tested, and maybe this is sort of a leading question, but what do you think they prefer, the client?
I think that our clients, it would depend a lot on the type of client that you're dealing with, but most of the specialized caseload clients that I dealt with and that I would see in administrative hearings now tend to like the fact that the oral fluids test is a lot more dignified, and they also like the fact that it is lab tested as opposed to some of the instant urine tests that we have used and we still use because, of course, we use those for diagnostic purposes, and they like the fact that they get that instant result. But then if we need to lab confirm it, that's actually a whole nother test. It's a little bit more costly for them. This is kind of an all-encompassing one test. They don't get the result right away, but then they can move forward. So I do think they like the fact that it's more dignified and it allows them that lab confirmation too.
And how about the officers?
I think the officers probably, if I went in and polled every single one, I think they would probably choose the oral fluids. Main reason is none of our folks really like to have to handle the urine. Even though it's not blood and it's not that type of bodily fluid that everybody has the horror of, there's still, like you said in your slide, the yuck factor. Nobody wants it on their desk. Nobody wants it anywhere in their presence, and that tends to be a problem because there's always that cleanup. Even though the offender has to go dump that out, the officer still has some responsibility in cleaning up the space where they were doing the testing. So they definitely do like the fact that the oral fluids doesn't have the yuck factor, and they can do it all within the scope of their office visit and not have to go to a whole other room.
Perfect. Thank you, Roxanne. And I'm just going to do a conclusion here, but if you have anything to add to anything I'm about to say, please feel free to jump right in. Just as a conclusion, again, the advantages of oral fluid testing, I think Roxanne probably said it best. It's not urine testing. And again, urine testing may be the method that fits your situation best, and if so, that's the method to go with. But it's good to know that there are alternatives out there, and lab-based oral fluid testing in particular matches up well with a lot of criminal justice as well as workplace, even school drug testing situations. You've got the whole gender collector issue being eliminated. You're not trying to match gender of the collector and the donor when it comes to oral fluid testing. Every single collection is completely observable. So the donor and the collector are side by side going through the testing process together within full view of one another. That's why in the workplace market, unions like oral fluid testing a lot, because there's never any concern that somebody is manipulating the collection to try to manipulate the result of a test to hurt somebody unjustly. The collection process is not embarrassing. As Roxanne said, the dignity of the donor is always protected and secured with oral fluid testing. Eliminates the need for all the various precautions that you normally have to go to with urine testing, turning off the hot water in the bathroom, putting blue dye in the toilet water, things of that nature. All of that eliminated with oral fluid testing. Roxanne referred to the shy bladder issue. That, of course, adds time to the testing process if you have an individual who cannot void a sample. That, of course, is eliminated when it comes to oral fluid testing, the yuck factor. And I think the thing that people really like a lot with oral fluid testing is that it's virtually adulteration-proof. There has to be some method out there that can help somebody cheat on an oral fluid test, but I've gone through a lot of websites. In fact, I just wrote an article for a magazine on drug test cheating and reviewed everything I could find again. And there's some mouthwash products out there that they claim to help people cheat on an oral fluid test, but I always read the fine print. And when you read the fine print, it tells you, and then wait X number of hours before submitting your oral fluid sample, or make sure that that you don't use drugs within 24 hours, and rinse your mouth with this mouthwash. All kinds of other things that the best way to pass a drug test is just not to have any drugs in your system, and basically that's what the advice is being given when it comes to quote unquote cheating on an oral fluid test. Is just don't use drugs for 24, 48 hours, and you increase your chances of passing the test. So those are some of the advantages of oral fluid testing. Anything that you'd like to add in closing, Roxanne?
I think in closing, what I would like to say to those folks who are practitioners and are thinking about incorporating oral fluids testing into their toolbox, I think this is something that really flows well into the whole evidence-based practice that we're moving toward as a profession. It's one more tool in our toolbox, and we know that every tool we have doesn't fit every offender, so it gives us one more option to be able to work better with the clients that we serve.
Thank you. If you have any questions that we didn't get to today, most of them we covered during the Q&A part, but if there were any questions we didn't get to, you come up with other questions, please feel free to contact OraSure or contact me at bill@billcurrent.com. Be happy to provide that to you. Jessica is actually going to send you information following today's webinar. It's going to take about 24 hours, but you're going to get information about how to access all of this information from today's webinar. And with that, I'll turn the microphone back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Roxanne. And on behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.